this video, what I've gone and done is I've gone and created the teeth and the spines and done these in exactly the same way as we did the body, in that I used a high resolution version in the sculpt room, and we can see it here. Currently the body is showing only, and then I have my low poly version in the poly groups in here. So here, for example, you can see Dino, low poly body, CC within the poly groups. And this is what we can see here is this colored map. So let's just close this one down and open up the teeth first. And I'm going to change the UV map here to teeth. And we can see here that we've got a UV layout for the teeth. Now this UV layout is quite complex, only in terms of the number of pieces that have been put here. I've not really optimized this in any way, and in fact the teeth themselves have a very high polygon count for what's needed for this project. However, I just subdivided that quite a few times and then created those seams. And one thing I tried to do here is just to keep the seams on the inside of the mouth, as you can see here with this red line, so that the outer side of the teeth remained seam free. And then I did a quick unwrap and just placed these onto this UV space. This is a little bit over the top in terms of poly count, as I've mentioned. However, you can optimize this as much as you like. So with that done, let's move over and look at the spines. So I'll turn off the teeth layer and click on the spines. I'll change the UV map over to the spines, and we can see I've done exactly the same thing. Again, it's a very dense poly mesh that I've used for these, completely over the top. However, you can see that essentially each spine has been split from a UV shell point of view down the edge, and then we have a right side, and over on the other we have a left side, and these have been positioned on here. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to use mark seams here. I'm going to select this poly island, and let's select one of these. So over here, that's this one. We can see we have this UV shell, and if I click on the other side here, we can see there's the left side of that shell. So I haven't really organized this in any particular way. I've just unwrapped it very quickly and placed these on here. Let's deselect that, and we can see that in the sculpt tree here I've created a little sculpt for the teeth and the spines. So let's turn off the white dinosaur body that we can see here, and I'll just choose spines here. In order to see the sculpt, I need to turn off this poly model temporarily. So I'm just going to bring the opacity down for that, go over to my little drop down here and turn off the wireframe here, and we can see some of the marks that I very quickly drop down onto the sculpt object, just to define a little bit of texture on the spine itself. Move over to the teeth UV here, and I have my sculpt teeth object on here, and you can see that I went ahead with the tools inside the sculpt room and created some sculpt shapes onto those teeth. So let's take this back. Let's bring back our main shell, and let's bring all these objects here in the sculpt room, make them all visible so we can see them all on there. And I'll change this back and have my Retopo frame on there as well. So increase the color, the opacity of the polygons. So we're ready now to bake the high resolution information here onto our separate low polygon objects here. What we can do now is we can bake all three of these different objects, the body, the spines and the teeth, onto the low poly versions here, and we can do that all in one go. So that's what we'll do now, and we'll test and see what that looks like. Now, one thing that really helps with this process is if you name your poly groups exactly the same as your sculpt objects. So with that said, what I'm going to do now is just go over to Bake, and I'm going to check this small option here which says Name Correspondence for Baking. And this means essentially whatever this name is here, look for the same name here, and these two are going to be baked. And we can do this for multiple objects. So again, let's go back, name correspondence for baking. I'm going to bake with a normal map. So I've loaded in that same cage that we used in the previous video, which gave me roughly these settings here. And I'm just going to say OK. So now I've got my UVs, if you remember here, and it's given me the list of UVs, and I'm going to make the body a 4K map. I'm going to make the teeth just a 1K map, and the spines also I'll just make 1K because they're fairly small. I'll leave everything else the same and I'll say OK. Okay, that's finished now. So let's go over to the painting room to see the result of that bake. Now remember, every time that we come into the painting room from the sculpt room, our sculpt layers are all going to be visible. So we have to hide those here. We can hide them individually, or we can just hide the root of the sculpt hierarchy, which effectively just disables them all. So what we can see here now is purely the low res mesh. So let's just hit W on the keyboard, and there we can see that low res information again. Let's take away the wireframe and let's just zoom in, and we can see some of those spine objects on there. We can see that sculpt information on the spine. Let's move over to the teeth, and again on the teeth we can see that sculpt information that was created on the teeth, as well as the body that we previously had in the other videos. So what we've done here is we've essentially taken 3 objects now and baked them all together and made sure that our low poly and sculpt information have the same layer naming conventions in order to bake those objects all in one go. If I bring my texture editor here just a little bit over in the UI so we can see it a little bit clearer, I'll just make it a little bit bigger. Now because our shader back in the sculpt space that we used was essentially white or this light grey, that's why I'm having this light grey shade on here, and that shader color is represented by this layer here, which has this rather long name, sub D and whatever that number is. Let's look at this section here and look at the normals on here. So now I'm looking at the spines and I'm looking at the normal information on here, and we can see here at the top this is this map. Now when I change over from the spines to the teeth, you'll see here there is no change in terms of the naming of that layer. However, the teeth here have a different normal map on them that's actually in this layer now. So whichever UV I am selecting here is updating this list of layers with the information relative to that UV. So let's do that again, and this time on the 4K dino body. I'll need to just move back on this one a little bit, and we can see that the name hasn't changed. It still says normal map, but you can see that underneath here this normal map icon has changed, reflecting this UV that's been selected here. So it can be confusing at times when you're working on these, because you may expect the normal map to say Dino 4K here, whereas it will only say normal map. And if I change it over back to the teeth, you saw it update there, but it still has the same naming convention. So instead of looking on the layers panel here, at the naming convention on here, just look at the actual UV set that you are observing within the texture editor to give you an understanding of which UV you are actually looking at and working on in this layers. Don't worry for now if this is a little bit confusing. We'll work through this step by step and it'll become clearer as we go along. We can bake these individually, and that's what I'll look at in the next video. See you next time.